They say once you have a Mad Men recap podcast, you have a podcasting problem. Every day, more about Will Ashton. Hey, Will.
Oh, that's my introduction. Hello.
I smell Mike Overholes, but that's impossible. Mike, calm down. You smell like chlorine, actually.
Clears my head.
Welcome to Mad Men. If this is your first time listening to us, why would it be? You came in a little bit late, but that's fine. People watched Mad Men pretty late along the series anyway. You can do that. We are a podcast talking about the show Mad Men. One of us is a first-time watcher of the show. That's Will. Say hey again, Will.
Hello. I was going to say all the things that, would confuse first-time listeners. So let's see. Chauncey, Chip and Dip.
What else? Something.
Yeah, thing like that.
Santa?
Hell's Bells,
Santa.
Trudy.
Yeah. I don't
one
know.
more.
I'm blanking. I don't have another one, John. You gotta help me out here. You're the one that watches this show.
That's true. I'm the one who watches it at least once a year. But Mike is the one who watched it back when it was airing. We don't do enough of that. Like, Mike watched it one time while it was airing. I feel like that's a very unique experience to be rewatching the show. That said, though, Mike, you routinely have to end up binging because you're like, oh yeah, I forgot how much I like this show and I can't stop.
Yeah, well, because I didn't really binge it the first time, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's my first time getting it's the first time I've watched a show that I've liked and had the ability to keep watching it. And Mad Men is so good. How do you stop yourself from continuing to watch it?
Yeah, no, because I think I've talked about it. I binged the first 3 seasons by the time I showed up to the scene, to the show. It wasn't, though, until season 5 that I was really invested. Every week, couldn't wait for the next episode. But anyway, we're talking about The Summer Man, which is the 8th episode of season 4. I can't believe we're already on episode 8. That's kind of wild. This is a big episode because it's coming right after The Suitcase, which many consider to be, as we talked about last time, one of the best episodes of television, let alone Mad Men. But this one is directed by the great Phil Abraham. His second episode of season 4. He did the first episode, Public Relations. And the writing room, it's a big one this week. It's Lisa Albert, Janet Leahy, and Matthew Weiner. But I did listen to the commentaries, and the writers really did a lot with this episode. It's a different episode, isn't it?
I just realized that Phil Abraham did the 2 ensemble episodes of the season because this is obviously without giving too much away, about a number of people. It's obviously kind of the inverse of last week where it was just primarily Peggy and Dawn focused. This is spread out, and then obviously the first episode has everyone kind of being reintroduced in some respects. So I guess Phil's the guy you hire when you need to spin multiple plates on Mad Men.
I think it's still heavily a Dawn episode, though.
It is, yeah. We get more Dawn than ever, and so does Bethany Van Nuys. Phil Abraham does direct one more episode this season. That's coming up, episode 11. So just a few episodes away from that one. This episode aired September 12th, 2010. And partially, I think, because of The Suitcase just being such a talked about water cooler episode, the ratings perked up quite a bit after this episode to 2.31 million, which was not the high for the season, but the highest for the season since episode 2. So there was a bit of a lull that this season had in the middle of it from the highs of the first episode. But should be mentioned, of course, that at this point, Mad Men has doubled its ratings, which 1 to 2, since the last couple of seasons. So very impressive that the show was really starting to pick up at this point, and it only took them 4 seasons to get to a place where they were really starting to get eyeballs. But aside from critics, at least, this episode's very strange. It is an interesting reset episode. Don trying to get sober, and this is the first thing I want to put out there. I was just thinking about this when I was rewatching the commentary with Matthew Weiner and Leo Trombetta, the editor of the episode, because Phil Abraham couldn't make it to the DVD commentary. But this feels like a season 1 episode to me. I've never noticed that before. I don't know if it's just me though. What do you think, Mike? Because you've seen the show more than Will has, so maybe you can back me up or attack me.
100%. There's this contemplativeness of this episode that a lot of season 1 had that we haven't really seen since. And I think it's because, I don't know, maybe Weiner was more cerebral with the first season and understanding the psychological things that Don Draper was going through with being Dick Whitman and all this thing. And once that ended, it just became like this workplace drama. But I feel like it goes back to its roots as this psychological, like, picture of a disturbed man and how he's living his life. Like, it's Weiner at his best.
Yeah, it's just like, it's the mood, like the psychological mood that you're referencing there. And even the little things of like the misogyny in the workplace kind of comes back, but through a new lens, right? It's like a totally different context. But my suspicion is that, because in the commentary they talk about, like, we kind of knew what we want to do for this episode with at least like the Peggy Joan story, which is that Peggy can fire somebody, but Joan can't. And it makes me wonder if like Weiner and the other writers of the show, at one point had that idea, but a long time ago, back when they were developing the first 2 seasons maybe. And we're like, we'll save that for when it makes more sense for Peggy to have that kind of power. And so maybe that's why like elements of at least the Peggy Joan story do feel a lot like their dynamic back then, where it's like very different from, I think, like where we've kind of seen them track a little bit later where Joan has more power, but they are building up to it throughout season 4. You get those little moments with Joan and Joey all throughout of like, oh yeah, he does not respect her. He has an issue with her and it's going to blow up at some point. But what do you think, Will? I know you're kind of experiencing this for the first time. Do we sound like idiots?
No, I was going to say, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this episode feels like a throwback is because the earlier seasons were more, I think, deliberate with it's John Cheever. Is that the writer that the Matthew Weiner takes most inspiration from? Am I mispronouncing the name?
I don't remember who you're referencing. Is that talked about more in Mad Men Carousel?
I think he mentions it, but I was going to say, like,
he might.
The previous seasons, this season and last season have gone to great lengths to kind of be more cinematic, kind of be a little bit more visually striking. And this is obviously a very writer episode. Like, it's kind of going back to how academic and literary the show was earlier on, when it was kind of feeling like this big, long, expansive novel in show form. And having Don Hamm, having Don Draper kind of have, like, you know, this like Paul Schrader-esque like writing motif throughout of him kind of writing his thoughts and musings, and having narration and like having, you know, very descriptive ways of describing the scene rather than playing them out purely visually, feels like something that would be more akin, I think, to the earlier seasons as opposed to what we've seen so far in this season. That's not to say that this episode doesn't have cinematic flourishes. Obviously, the Rolling Stones needle drop, I think, has a very kind of cinematic and exciting quality to it. It's always fun when the show, even though obviously the Rolling Stones were coming to be in the 60s, it feels a little bit more present. It feels a little bit more electrifying when you have like such a, you know, electrifying song like that come into the fold. But otherwise,
song
I think
about
it is
advertising, by the way, Satisfaction.
Is that right?
Yeah. Weiner brings up in the commentary, so he didn't realize that until he was making the show.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think otherwise it has a kind of more literary quality, and I think that's why it feels like something that's more akin to the earlier seasons.
I will say, to bring up John Cheever, if that is an influence Weiner has, I haven't actually heard that. I knew, but one of his more famous short stories, John Cheever, is the
Swimmer. I was like, yeah, because I looked it up and I was like, oh, that guy. Because you're totally right, Will. He's a major influence. I think of Frank O'Hara more when I'm thinking of like the people that Weiner's talked about. But I think you're right that he has brought up Cheever before. And The Swimmer is definitely probably the bigger Cheever short story. That I didn't realize that was him. But it makes sense. And the stuff where Don is doing the voiceover, and I do want to kind of get y'all's opinions on that. How do you think it works out? There, according to Weiner himself, apparently those diary entries are based on a real diary from the 1960s, kind of mixed in with stuff from Matthew Weiner's own diary. So, for example, Weiner, when he was 30, he wrote that line about like when a man walks into a room, he brings his whole life with him, which people listening to the show will probably remember. We've kind of talked about that kind of concept because it comes up, you know, like throughout the show, because that is like something that like was really at the forefront of Weiner's mind when he was coming up with the character of Don Draper. And that it's kind of getting paid off, I guess, even more explicitly in this episode. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I have to laugh because I'm imagining Matthew Weiner's diaries put into this guy's diaries and it being like, a man takes his whole life with him. Also, what's the deal with my son? Why is he so weird?
Yeah. Man,
is that my fault?
Writing The Sopranos sure is hard.
Yeah.
I do want to turns the page. Sand everywhere. Jan everywhere.
I'm going to be sexually harassing somebody today. There's definitely...
Jeez, Mr. Buzzkill over here.
Oh, yeah. Well, I put humorless bitch in... I put it in Mike's caption for our video call. But so in the commentary, I did mention that Leo Trombetta, the editor of the episode, is in there. And Will, you did touch on the cinematic flourishes. And they were kind of gushing about how they wanted this to feel like film noir. And Weiner was like, of course, like leaping praise on how the episode is edited and like the cuts and everything. Like he especially called out the scene where Don is like in the pool and it like transitions to, him sitting there not wanting to drink. And I get what you're saying, but like hearing it from their perspective, of course, has that effect of like, oh, wow, it's kind of cool to be in their heads, kind of walking through a little bit more of the technical stuff of the scenes. That's always for me the most interesting stuff in the commentaries, but they don't always get to it. And there are nice little touches throughout the episode. I really, especially because it would be so easy for the noir stuff to just not work. But does the voiceover stuff work for you guys overall? Like, I feel like sometimes I cringe a little bit when the episode starts, but then I ease into it. I don't know.
Maybe that's like an intended like effect to have on the audience. I wouldn't agree that I'm saying I feel that way when I hear the voiceover, but like, isn't that kind of how Don's feeling about leaping into sobriety and this like...
Yeah, well, he feels awkward about having a diary too.
Yeah, definitely. Also, did either of you catch the date of the first entry?
What was it? May?
June 15th, dude. We were so close.
June 15th. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Suitcase was in May.
I mean, I will say, I don't know about you guys. It has been super hot here in Pennsylvania, and I was in the pool yesterday. So
nice.
I was, after watching the episode, I was feeling like Don, being splishy splashy in the pool.
Do you remember the temperature?
What was that?
You want a drink, Lashin?
But sorry, what were you asking, Mike? You had a question?
That's what Mike said.
You also asked.
Well, what was the temperature, Will? Like, how hot was it in Pennsylvania?
Yesterday, it was like 102, I think it got to when I went to the pool.
Oh, man. Yeah, because it's going to be like 98 here in the Bay Area today where I am. Mm-hmm. And
it's been fluctuating between like 80 to like 100 something this week.
We're all summer, man.
Yeah. So I'm definitely feeling I'm feeling the heat. Not just from John Negroni, but outside as well.
Well, hopefully I'm not giving you that much trouble, but
I don't know.
Yeah, but no, the voiceover worked for you guys more than it didn't.
I think mostly it did. Like I said, it kind of gave me like a Paul Schrader vibe. Like you're kind of watching the psychosis of a man trying to figure himself out. He's at his desk. He's writing. The only difference here is that he's trying not to drink, as opposed to a Schrader character who is lamenting his woes at the bottom of a glass. But I think the one instance where it stuck out to me that didn't really work as well was when Don is getting head and he's like looking out the window, and it has like such a beautiful shot, but
she's
like
a nice
kind of
girl.
Right. He's like saying stuff like that. He's just like, I wonder who else getting their rocks off here in the city. And it's like, I don't know. I feel like this is kind of just needless. I think it would have been a much more effective shot if it just was like him focusing up on the sky. It's already such a beautiful shot that I don't know.
I agree.
That was
completely.
like the one thing where I was like, yeah, you can scrap that.
I like Martin Scorsese way too much to not like a good opening narrator or a narrator for the entire fucking movie to say the least. But it works for me, guys. Like even that shot, I think it's great.
I think for me,
how would you feel if
go ahead.
Don just instantly just broke the fourth wall? And just like, Don, drink.
All my life, I wanted to be a madman.
All my life, I wanted to cheat on my wife. Yeah, I think when I'm watching those like scenes, I think what it is too is that at least the first few times I watched it, I struggled a little bit with it because I was like, I don't want to be in Don's head. Like, I want that mystery. Like, I feel like trying to figure Don out is like half the fun of his scenes. So like having him talk about what's in his head kind of just rubs me the wrong way sometimes. But I did kind of get to this point where I'm like, well, we're not really in his head. This is dialogue.
It's also meaningless.
It's meaningless, and he's like writing it down, which means he knows that like, yeah, it's his own personal thing, but he knows that somebody could find it one day. And he's still trying to like present or perform a version of himself, honestly, it's not really what's in his head. And when you start to watch the scenes that way, it's way more interesting to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also would argue, like, especially for like first time journalers, it's like almost impossible to actually be like that authentic. I do think you are putting like a version of yourself down on the page that is, yeah, definitely different and maybe in a better view of of what's actually going on.
Well, we've talked about before, right? That like when it comes to authenticity, that's part of the creative process. I mean, some of the most successful creative work comes from honesty, comes from like laying your soul bare. You know, even something as dumb as a glow coat commercial, I think has like a layer of honesty, of like some kind of feeling that Peggy and Don arrived at. And speaking of that, I do kind of wonder when it comes to Don's sobriety, and he's just like, I'm, trying to actually make a positive change. It's been a few weeks since the Suitcase, and I think you can reasonably surmise that Anna's death is playing a huge part in this. That night with Peggy and how they kind of like reconciled a lot of things, and what happened with Duck, how humiliating that was. That's how I read into it. It's like, it's not one thing that's triggering this change. It's definitely just like Don is embarrassed more than anything else. And he just wants, like he says it, he wants more control, control over everything. But he writes it down as like control of how I'm feeling. But I think even that's a little bit of a feint. It's more than that. It's like how my actions impact others and how they perceive me.
When you get your ass kicked by Duck, it's time to give a fuck.
Will could write political slogans. But yeah, Will, I mean, do you like this episode overall? I mean, did you come out of it kind of feeling like this was a step down from the Suitcase in some ways, or did it feel like it was like a natural next step? But where do you come at it?
I mean, I think it was going to be hard to match the Suitcase. If anything, I would have been more surprised if it was as good as that episode. And I think it is a good episode. I think I was maybe a little misled by you because prior to watching it, you're just like, this is a good ep. And I hear it like the Summer Man. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be fun. Like, this is going to be some good splishy splashy. And I see Don in the pool and I'm like, this is going to be a rollicking good time. And we deal with some pretty heavy subject matter, like sexual harassment in the workplace and alcoholism and, marital strife and all this stuff. And it's like,
somebody gets mooned.
This was good. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, is this the first instance of nudity in Mad Men so far?
No. We've seen some stuff.
I mean, like from a cast member, because like we've seen like the pictures of like naked women and stuff, but have we seen?
I feel like we've seen butts from like Dawn Affairs.
I don't know if we've seen like full on butts like all the way, but we've seen some curves.
I think this is the first butt we've seen on Mad Men. I feel pretty confident about that.
Weiner did point out that it is really Stan's butt. They didn't use any kind of like trickery or none of that. It's like actually,
it's a nice butt. I thought it was good.
Yeah, he works out.
Yeah.
They didn't pull The Boys and use someone else's
wang,
someone else's laser beams.
I lost my train of thought thinking about Stan's ass. I don't know what I was talking about before.
Well, you were asking about nudity, if you've seen that, right?
No, before that. I mean...
Oh, before that?
Whatever.
Hey, look, his ass will do that to you. Yeah.
I mean, distracted... what's his face? Joey. It distracted me.
Yeah, that's right. Why do you... So, yeah, Joey Baird, he's played by Matt Long. The other commentary in the episode was a trifecta. Christopher Stanley, who plays Henry Francis, and Rich Summer, who plays Harry Crane, and of course Matt Long, who plays Joey Baird. And it was an interesting commentary. They talked a little bit more than sometimes the actors do. Sometimes the actors in these commentaries for theirs, they just kind of like goof around and crack jokes and be like, man, that was hard to shoot. And it's like, yeah, your mom was, like stuff like that, just like clowning. And then you get to the Weiner one, and it's like Weiner having a conversation with himself while the other person meekly chimes in out of obligation every 10 minutes. But in this case,
so
true for the Weiner one still.
So what you're saying is that the actor's commentary is like Joey and the boys goofing around, and the Weiner one
I'm going to say the opposite. It's the opposite.
The Weiner one is just Don Draper writing his notes, And then occasionally someone like, yeah, it looks good.
Yeah, that's definitely true for that one. But no, I think I really like Christopher Stanley and Rich Sommer in the commentaries. I don't think I'd heard Rich Sommer before, and I think this might have been Henry Francis's first time, but doing a commentary. But it was really fun to listen because they talked a lot about, you know, stuff very specific to like the acting in this episode, especially with Henry. And Henry is very, very. He has way more of a personality in this episode. I know I said this before, guys, but
thinking about a nice juicy steak right now, I think is what's happening. Sorry,
well, whenever I mention Christopher Stanley, I mean, Mike is just kind of like, oh yeah, gets a little dreamy. I mean, he takes his shirt off in this episode. Speaking of nudity, he's looking good.
Yeah, he shows that old man body off.
I gotta say, guys, like compared to when I first watched the show, I hated Henry Francis for like the first couple seasons, and when I was first watching the show. But like, I think at this point, I like Henry. I like this guy. What is it? I'm like turning into Bobby, where he's like my stepdad.
I think it's because you're getting older and he's an actual adult among mostly man children and whatnot.
Yeah, when you're younger, you're just like, Don, badass.
Right.
But then you're just like, man, Don, dude, what are you doing?
Henry, just to me, is just like, he's so just palatable. Like, he never does anything that you're like, hell yeah, Henry Francis. Like, even politically, I feel like he's never, he never has like the JFK name drop moment, like from Oppenheimer, you know what I mean? Where it's like, oh, he was doing cool shit. No, he's like doing stuff with the Rockefellers. But he also never does anything like particularly horrible. He's not Greg, who like is the low point of this episode for me. Like, I hated Joan Greg storyline. I just like tune it out. I'm so like tired of him. I think on the rewatch, speaking of changing opinions, I just don't like Joan. I think maybe at all.
What? Now, I will say, Joan is tough to like in this episode, for sure. But I always root for Joan. To me, Joan is probably the heart of the show for me.
I'm cool with Joan.
Heart?
Yeah. Okay.
I think Peggy is the heart of the show from my perspective, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think Peggy for me is the soul of the show. I think that like she's the perspective of it. She's like the kind of, and I think Dawn is kind of our avatar, but
I think Dawn
that's
is
a me
the
thing.
penis
I think
of the show.
I think people can. Well, no, I think Peggy can be the heart of the show for a lot of other people. I think for some people, maybe even Harry Crane is the heart of the show. Like people can have their opinions, but I don't know. I just feel like this is a tough episode to like for Joan because she is a little unlikable at certain moments of this. But she even like her little power move.
When is she?
What?
When's Joan likable? If this is an episode where she's unlikable, I would say she's definitely more unlikable in this episode. But she's usually like pretty annoying. She's a dick to Peggy for years.
I think she's looking out for Peggy.
I think she's generally sort of sympathetic. Like she always puts Roger in his place, which is always good.
She has great zingers. I think she's a fun character because she's so competent. And like watching her kind of like navigate this world in a way that really respects and understands her femininity while also her acknowledging the limits of that and how it's come back to hurt her at the same time. There are so many great Joan moments in that respect. That moment when they bring her back into the agency to start the new one at the end of the last season. I mean, that to me is like one of the great Joan moments because you're like, you're feeling it. You're like, oh, I just want this character to be back, So yeah, I mean, I think she's really likable when she deals with Pete and Lane. I think it's great.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I feel like you really feel her absence when she's briefly gone and she's like not working in the office, and you're like, oh, I miss Joan when she was calling the shots here and stuff. It's just not the same.
I think Mike is a little bit like Joey right now. His mom's a Joan.
Dude. Let me tell you about Big Ragu. There's always one. Dude. The read though of when he calls her a madame at an Asian whorehouse, that's tough. That'd be tough now. Had to be even tougher in the goddamn 60s.
When Joey has that line where he's like saying that she dresses like she wants to be raped, I mean, that to me is like how Joey becomes instantly a villain there. Like it's just so despicable. And it's kind of weird to listen to the commentary because Weiner is talking about how they're trying to also make it so that Joey is sort of sympathetic, or like apparently they wanted to write it so that like, no, Joey's just kind of like a regular person. What he's doing is not cool. And there's also this moment where in the commentary, he's kind of like, oh, we asked the guys around the show about like the picture, the Tally Ho picture. And the guys were like, oh yeah, that's not cool, but that's not a big deal or whatever. And I'm like, what? And then Weiner says like, but we asked all the women in the office and they're like, what are you talking about? That's horrible. Like your coworker does that to you, like fire them. So like, I felt a little bit of like the show's age, I guess there for me. I was like, man,
I have to say that obviously the stuff about Weiner came out after the fact, but I'm of the opinion that Weiner probably should just shut the fuck up about sexual harassment.
Yeah, it's like he's a tough, because it comes back to, I think, like infamously when they're talking about the rape scene with Pete and the au pair. It's like that same kind of thing where he's kind of trying to like both sides it a little bit and be like, it's consensual to it. In fact, I was like, what the hell are you talking about? It's your own show. But it does speak to like, there has been a lot of conversation around like how much impact did Weiner have on the writing? Because a lot of the time you don't have, a clear idea, because it's a writer's room, but you don't have a clear idea of like who owns what. And he's talked about that when he does the commentaries of like, I don't know, where does an idea really come from? And more as I'm listening to these commentaries for the first time, I get the sense that he kind of comes off, at least either intentionally or unintentionally. I don't want to disparage the man, but it kind of comes off like he takes other people's contributions and doesn't always attribute them. Sometimes the way he talks about this stuff, he makes it sound like it's him, when maybe it is, right? Like I'm sure a lot of it is, but other times like it's hard to tell because he will credit writers on very specific things, but then he doesn't credit anybody on other things, and it makes it sound like it's coming from him. And so it makes me wonder if like how much of the show really,
he's putting a layer of glove coat on everything.
Right. I mean, he said it in the commentary of the last episode of like, like whose idea, like he's like, I've been the Don in the situation. I've been the Peggy. And I'm not saying that makes him a bad person or anything like that, but it can be misleading. And I think people should be aware of that, of like in anything that they're kind of engaging with, that sometimes people even unintentionally can misrepresent the creative ownership of something and not properly, make clear that it was a contribution from and it's a tough thing for me to say because he does attribute people a lot, right? I really want to make sure the context is clear there, that he's always talking about the other writers and like, oh, they had this idea and this person came up with this. But anyway,
I think that's fascinating.
I'll leave it at that.
I was gonna say, I think that's fascinating in a number of respects, but for me, like I was saying before, I think the fact that this has the perception, at least early on, of being, like a novel and like he's like the author of the story, I can understand if like the ego of that kind of went to his head a little bit, obviously as the reviews and all this stuff came in, but it's fascinating to me to see that from him after The Sopranos, where I'm not saying David Chase had an ego, I'm saying that like there was a similar sort of thing where people are like treating him not just as like a regular show creator, but like he's like, the director of this like big long movie that came out, and like he's obviously a huge part of the later seasons, like the better seasons even of that show. But like, I think it's fascinating that I'm sure he probably was begrudged in some respects. Like, David Chase probably got credit for a lot of the things that, he did or he brought to the show. But, it kind of becomes twofold when he has his own show and he does a similar thing.
Idea theft begets idea theft.
That's Mike's own diary.
I do want to go back to she dresses like she wants to get raped. It does still just blow my mind, no matter how many times I've watched Mad Men, that a show written and shot in the early thousands, based in the 60s, like, is still a relevant talking point to today. Like, women, like how women dress for sexual assault, like is 100% still a relevant topic, and things that will get headlines like on Fox News. The boys will be boys, like, absolutely is as well. And so it's just so, like, again, I love Mad Men, but why I stay is like for like the social commentary and how relevant it still is. Like, it blows my mind when like things like this come up,
especially because the show brings up some things that like aren't always talked about in that realm. For one thing, like Peggy's role in it, because what's unique about the Peggy situation here, especially compared to season 1, is that she's one of the boys. Like, she's in that group. You know, they kind of view her as like, they feel comfortable enough to joke around her. And Joe even says, like, I was wrong about you, because he thought, that Peggy wouldn't take an issue. And he kind of had this, like, gender blindness to it of like, well, Peggy gets it. And no, I mean, there was a line. And she completely crossed it. Will, I see you're drinking 7-Up. You should be drinking Mountain Dew. What are you doing? Oh, sorry. I it is Mountain Dew. I'm sorry, Will Ashton. It looked like 7-Up from this angle.
Thank you for apologizing for that slander that you just said right there.
I could have sworn it was 7-Up, and I was like, for this episode? Will, have you ever had the Witch's Brew, the Mountain Dew thing?
Cocktail? I don't know if I have.
It's a real thing.
Actually, I'm sorry. That's what it's called. Yeah, I have absolutely had that. I have 100%
I feel like I've seen it at parties, and
I have 100% had the cocktails, quote unquote, that they've had in this episode. Yeah.
Mike's never had alcohol, so I know
he's a good Christian boy, has never uttered
lies to his parents,
profane word, never uttered an impure thought.
All right, what are you drinking though, Mike? Because it is 8:38 a.m. for both of us.
What do you think I'm drinking, bro?
I first saw that.
I went to a party last night.
I thought it was whiskey when I first saw it, but that's clearly not.
It's iced tea, right?
There's one way to get over being hungover, bro, and is get the on the wagon. it's iced tea.
Nice call, Will. I've lost my touch with the teas.
Well, is that usually like for shows like this, like when they like have whiskey, don't they usually do like iced tea or something like that kind of substitute?
Yeah, or they use like a food dye or something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Don fighting his sobriety is a big thing in this episode. I really like how they shoot a lot of that stuff of like his unwillingness.
It's great.
But like it's so good because you're watching him and you just like you feel his like indecisiveness and how the struggle of it, and it's not overwritten, honestly. And even that like moment when he is like kind of drinking the wine and he in the date with Dr. Miller, and I love it because it's just like apparently Jon Hamm improvised that because they didn't know how to write it. They were like, all they wrote in the script was John feels it when he drinks the wine, and then all of that stuff that Jon Hamm does with his facial expressions, that's all him. And I think we talked about it last time too. Like he's just really good at playing a drunk for reasons that we also touched upon last time, which came up in the news recently because of that article, the interview he did. People were kind of talking about like, weren't you in a fraternity and you were, you did all that stuff? Yeah. We don't have to.
The shot though, again. when he's in the office and he takes that drink, like after watching everybody drinking and but like how it zooms in and like
the pull out, in and the pull out. That's great. Yeah.
That also reminds me of season 1. I feel like season 1, they always, I think, told like these stories visually a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
I really did like that specific.
See, that was like the
music cues. Yeah.
That reminded me more of like season 2, like when Dawn is like getting ready to pass out in California, and like it feels intentionally kind of jarring compared to the style of the rest of the show.
Yeah, because hey, look, he missed the pool in that instance. In this case, he's in it.
It kind of reminds me of him watching The Fly in the first season. I don't know, because obviously it's a little bit different, but they gave me that feel.
That's interesting. I don't know why, but this episode does too also remind me of, Marriage of Figaro. And I do know why, because like the birthday party and stuff and the heat of the episode and really like that whole, the phone conversation he has with Henry and then showing up and Henry's like mowing his lawn. And it's just like such an inverse of Marriage of Figaro from just a few seasons ago. And like Don's pain and like the moment when he's on the phone and he wants to drink, right after that conversation because it's so awful. I mean, Henry is basically saying like, you're not don't show up to this party. I bought a boat and get your shit out of the house that I'm living in that used to be yours. I mean, it's just brutal.
See, when you mentioned Marriage of Figaro, I just had the thought of Dawn crashing the party and bringing another dog with him.
For Gene.
Right.
That would be pretty
But
funny.
then the thought was like, hey, I was in the office and I met this very good boy here. His name is Chauncey and he's looking for a new home.
He's retiring from the rat race of NYC. He just wants to find a nice family and settle down.
John, is it finally time though that we tell Will? Will,
yes.
We got to do the math with you, buddy. Chauncey goes missing in 1959.
Sure.
It's now what, 1964?
1965.
Chauncey's dead, man. Chauncey is not alive anymore. He was an old man already.
See, that would be the case for a normal dog. But you don't understand that that this is like Shaggy Dog rules, where like he is imbued with the. No, I was gonna say Shaggy Dog rules, where it's like like there's like a little Tim Allen in there, so it's like kind of like a mix in between. Like I don't think Tim Allen Shaggy Dog is like he's not like gonna die at whatever like 12 or 14. Like he's probably gonna live pretty long because he's half human at that point. So. I think that's what's happening with Chauncey.
With Shaggy Dog.
No, you're thinking of 9 Lives, which is one of his last pre-canceled films. Directed by Barry Sonnenfeld.
Oh boy. I don't know how to transition out of that.
I can. Can we talk about the literal best part of this episode, though? Can we finally give it some airtime?
But we already talked about Jon Hamm's body in the pool. Oh, I just thought about it.
So if you remember... I think maybe I said it in my head. Maybe I said it on the podcast. We can go back and listen. Way back when we were talking about that time that they were shooting a commercial and smoke was getting into Pete's like face and he was like coughing and freaking out about it. Talk about how great of a use of Vincent Kartheiser that was just for like a small moment. That's the second best use. The first best use is in this episode when he goes, "What is going on? I was on an important telephone call." And then goes, "When do we get a vending machine?"
I love it so much. We only get a little bit of Pete, and it's so great because you have this like big like sexual harassment workplace drama happen and unfold. Harry runs off because he's like, "I'm not a part of this." Peggy is just sort of like, and then Pete's just like, "Yeah, okay, fine, but when did we get a vending machine?" It's the show's laugh out loud moment. The episodes. It's great.
And it's like, and thank God they have Pete to deliver it. Like, because it's just, oh man, it's perfect.
It shows you too of like the dichotomy between Pete and Ken is so different now because like Ken is like not like a Pete right now. He's not like on any phone calls. He's just hanging out and goofing off still. He's still Ken. He's just Ken.
He's just Ken.
Yeah, I was waiting. I was like, who's going to do it first?
When he has a story, he grabs a pen.
Don is so sober that he asks Faye on a date. First, by the way, he's sober enough. He shows up to work on time and he catches that she's breaking up with her boyfriend. And he also catches that she's Jewish. Not something that I caught that the episode is foretelling, but in the commentary, Weiner says like, yeah, when that whole like shit in the ocean thing is a Yiddish saying. And Don's kind of like look is that he knows that. And he realizes then that, I mean, of course, we know Don has a type. And she's been looking to satisfy that Rachel Menken, longing for quite a while now. She's still with Tilting Cats, right?
For way too long. You know what I mean? He's trying to go back.
He's trying to return to the promised land. But he uses that information, right, to like, he was sober enough and he was on time enough that like he got that. He was in control. And so when they're in that meeting, again, he's not drunk, he's not embarrassing himself. He's not doing like a drunk pass at her like he's done over and over again. He's just kind of chilling normal about it. And it's just like, hey, let's get some dinner. And when she's kind of like, oh, ask me on a real day. He's like, sure. Yeah. Like it's very functional and normal. I like this episode for that reason, because we spent 7 episodes just seeing Don crumble. And of course we get this episode where he's picking up the pieces. Here's this person that genuinely seems to intrigue him in a way that like Bethany just kind of doesn't. Like, I think that a conversation, like compare the conversation he has with Bethany, which is just so awkward, to like with Dr. Faye. He immediately opens up to her, immediately is just like, it's my son's birthday, like, and I can't go. And he's just like, I like to go swimming. Like he's being genuine with a person he knows who like has a lot of intuition. And even the juxtaposition between like when he's making out with Bethany in the car versus when he's making out with Faye, it's like, it's more passionate. It's more spontaneous. We actually see how it happens for the first time. And he holds back a little bit. And I think that the contrast is so nice. Like you really just see like Don kind of enjoying this side of himself. Like he has a few slip ups with like, he drinks a little bit in the episode and everything, but he's still seeing some benefits from these new changes he's making. And that's why I like it.
I also noticed that when I was reading the Mad Men carousel that he pointed out something interesting, which is that, as Matt Zoller-Seitz was pointing out, that she, in some respects, is kind of similar to Dawn. Like, she's like a self-made woman who kind of had to reinvent herself to rise in the business and stuff. And I don't know if that's something that Dawn sees or if that's just kind of a literary choice. But I think that's also pretty interesting, considering that, I think one of the reasons why Don hasn't felt as comfortable with some of the women he's been with is that he hasn't really found an equal like he found with Rachel, or like someone that, like, even if he's not the same personality wise, like something that he can like feel like he's emotionally or intellectually akin to. And I think he finally found that again. So that's why his mojo is also coming back.
Well, you know what? Well, that's a really great thing to point out, because there is that famous line in this episode. It's one of the all-time Mad Men lines, which is like, people tell you who they are, but we only see them the way that we want them to be. Like, I'm kind of butchering it, but it's like essentially saying that, like, we see people the way that, we project, our emotions and feelings onto people. And I think something about, like, Don clearly sees that about Bethany. The moment that Bethany sees Betty and is kind of like, whoa, you were able to marry somebody that hot. Like, basically that's what she's the reaction she's having. And then she like kind of starts to really like go after Don more aggressively. I think that he sees right through that, of like, she doesn't really see Don. She just kind of sees Don the way that she wants Don to be for her. And I think something that sticks out about Dr. Miller is that she just doesn't do that. Like, she kind of sees through the bullshit, and he can just kind of be himself.
I was just going to say real quick, I think that he is thinking that, but he's also thinking, I like blowjobs. Blowjobs are good. Me love blowjobs.
He just wouldn't write
anyone
it in
else?
his diary, yeah.
Anyone else coming in here?
He's thinking, Tayo! The moment, like, especially first time watching, knew that Dr. Miller was going to be liked by Dawn. She does the smartest thing you could do on a first date with Don Draper. She compares him to her dad. He's a 2-bit gangster like you. Oh, season, dude. That's all Don needed to hear.
Yeah, I mean, she just, I think that, like, intellectually and just like with her emotional intelligence, her self-awareness, I just think it's all stuff that even in an episode where she's just like yelling in that office, I just think, yeah, Don just respects that in people. I think it's something that he respected in Rachel, especially because if you really look at the true loves that Don has had throughout the last few seasons, Rachel, I think, definitely stands out, especially compared to, like, in that season, characters like Midge. It's just, I think he gets bored of those affairs at a certain point, of like, they tap into a side of himself that's very carnal and everything, but I think he just kind of wants to find somebody who satisfies him intellectually. And part of it's very selfish of him and very like condescending too, especially because, how much time did we spend with Betty was just like, I'm not an idiot. She's like, a lot of the issues that we're having are because of you, not me. And she's very right about that. But anyway, she knows Italian. There's a lot of other stuff in this episode. With Henry, well, I know we already kind of talked about the Henry stuff a little bit, but when it comes to Henry and Betty, because we kind of touched on the dinner that they have, and he's pretty mad at her. Like, he's not letting this go easily. And then Francine kind of has that talk, like, Betty, you're kind of blowing this. Like, can you like not fuck up, like, for once? What's your read on that? Like, do you think it's as straightforward as the episode presents it, or do you think there's another side to it?
I think it's a lot of things kind of coming to a head. Like, I think there's been a lot of like disgruntlements that have been going on since the beginning of their relationship. It's never really been founded on the most honest or, the most chaste of terms. Obviously, I think it was built upon an affair. And, I think a lot of respects, like Henry was saying, like, they might have jumped into it a little too soon. They got married like a year or so after she got divorced. And I think it's just because with age, and also I think with life experience, Henry is more the adult, and I think he's a little bit more pragmatic. I think he's a little bit more emotionally mature. I don't think he's entirely the case, because like, obviously he did sort of petty things like we're talking about, or like cutting the grass when Dawn's there and like driving into his stuff or whatever. But I think he can be a little bit more controlled in his temperament and emotions in a way that Betty obviously even though she's made great progress in many respects, I think she still has that sort of girlish, like, inability to really healthily process her emotions and her concern, and, like, something like that, where she's seeing her ex-husband dinner, getting along with a girl fairly younger than him, who kind of looks like a replacement for Betty in some respects. It bites at her in a way that I don't think Henry's being fully sympathetic of that, but I can also understand that, like, there's kind of a time and a place to handle that emotionally, and it doesn't seem like she can do that. And I think she makes great progress at the end. And I feel like in some respects Henry kind of regresses in the process. But yeah, I think it's a lot of their built up emotional drama kind of finding a release in this meetup of circumstances.
Yeah, you know what? I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Henry's passive aggressiveness is definitely very Dawn-like. And I think it's in that childishness and that sort of, like, I don't want to confront that. Like, he tries to confront her like an adult, and it doesn't really work because she is kind of just, like, shielded and
not an adult.
Yeah, and even when she kind of apologizes to him and stuff, I think it's like, for him, it's not enough because he knows this keeps happening. And I think that he's just like, he really wants Betty to kind of just get over this guy. And part of it is like, dude, like, she was with him for a long time and he's not being understanding of that. He's being kind of petty himself for sure. But also, I think Betty is just, I think Francine is right. She's just like, you need to kind of just let this go because it's impacting Henry. It's making him feel like there's nothing else he can do, like, to confront this like an adult. And I think that's why I find Henry really sympathetic here, even though I think he's also in the wrong and how he handles things. But, like, when he's talking to her, he's just like, hate's a strong word. He's like, I hate Nazis. Like, I think that it's very likable of him to just kind of put her in her place a little bit. But at the same time, he's also being super condescending instead of, like, just letting her process and, like, talking to her like an adult.
I did have to laugh at that line, the I hate Nazis, because it kind of reminds me of, like, Ron Burgundy, like the inverse, where it's like, you destroy the one thing I love. What do you love? I love poetry. I love a good glass of scotch. And I love my dog Baxter.
But then to do all that and then be petty enough to just drive the car into the boxes.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's awesome.
Tough scene for them to shoot. It costs a lot of money for them to, like, shoot that, like, whole thing. Speaking of, like, a little bit of trivia, I want to sprinkle this into the lewd picture that Joey draws. Apparently they made that, most of it at least, with an iPad, which the iPad was, like, just coming out that year in 2010. They used their finger, and, like, apparently they just found the iPad kind of cool and were able to, like, do something like that with it, which is, I think, very impressive. I do like this, the moment where Don is like, wait, yeah, this has, like, forced perspective. Like, you sure Joey did this? Because Weiner says this thing about how he thinks that Joey isn't that good at his job. He's a bit of a screw up, and, like, that's how he reads the scene. Is like, he's not that great. But I don't know if you guys agree.
I think you can't trust the man who wears his tie that skinny.
We're about out of time, so I have one last question. I think we covered everything major, but guys, Peggy firing Joey. Do you think she did the right thing? I'm team yes. I think that, like, she needed to fire him, and I think that Joan is wrong, and that the way that she was handling it, like, I get, like, Joan's pride was injured there, but I think Peggy did the right thing. She stood up for her coworker, and I think she nipped something in the bud that needed to happen, because it would have just kept escalating. And I think Joan was being naive of, like, that she could handle it. That's my own personal take on it.
I think Joan, like a lot of people in this episode, is mad about something else and kind of uses their aggression to take it out on someone else. Like, obviously, like, Henry's mad at Betty, so he takes down Dawn, and, like, Joan is mad about her husband leaving and also not being respected enough in the workplace. So she still, I think, sees Peggy as underling, even though I think they're closer to equals in the office at this point than before. But yeah, I think Peggy could have been a little bit more discreet and resourceful about it. Like, I think, she's kind of green to the idea of, like, firing somebody, and she was kind of rash to do it in that way. But it's not like she did the wrong thing. Like, he was being incredibly unprofessional, and And
it pushed her too, because she tried to be diplomatic at first. Like, she didn't go into that meeting being like, I'm for sure going to fire him. He made a comment like it was attacking her too. He was just saying, this is why I don't like working with women. And I think Peggy was just like, you know what? Like, it's sad. Mm-hmm. It's sad, but like, especially when you watch that first episode of the season and they're so close, like they're buddy. They work well together. She likes him. He likes her.
Marsha. What was the thing they did together? Marsha.
But then she does have that moment where she's just like, hey, be serious, you know? And he's like a little bit like, okay, mom, even better. But I don't know, Mike, I know you probably agree since you're not the biggest Joan fan, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, Peggy's exactly right to fire her. I also just love that, like, I love when he tries to like call the bluff and be like, okay, I'm going to go talk to Don. And I think Don even knows who you are. Like, it's great. Yeah. It's great. And yeah, of course, like, Joan is mad just for the wrong reasons. You know what I mean? Like, instead of seeing a friend in the workplace and like women supporting women and understanding like the reasons Peggy did that, like, yeah, she's just mad about other things. And I think is also like, I think Peggy even says it well, like when Joan first explains it and she goes, well, same result. Like, it's
I think she resents Peggy, I think, for being arrogant about the situation and trying to get like credit, which I think makes sense. I think she also looks at the situation and is just like, why are you doing, like, I don't need you to stick up for me. Like, I can take care of myself. And I think she's projecting the frustration, the lack of power she has, or lack of influence she has on the men, and she puts it against Peggy. And I think Peggy kind of has this like very cringy, like girl boss, like I can be just like the guys. I can do what they do. And I think she's also kind of like being super naive in that sense of like not really understanding what her power really is. And the fact that like she first went running to Don and didn't know what to do about it. And Don kind of had to like set her like, you can't tattletale. Like, do you understand? Like you need to, but I think so much of that too is that like Peggy is a lot younger than Joan. She's 26. Joan is like 32 at this point. Joan's like a big sister. And I think that she kind of abuses that sort of like resentment that she has where like Peggy is like younger than me. And she like is able to have this stuff that I was told when I was growing up that I apparently missed by a few years that I could have because I leaned into what society said would work. And then she has to like go home to Greg and like, damn, you know, but hey, he's going to Vietnam. Will Ash, or he's going to basic training. Who knows if he'll go to Vietnam, actually.
I did like her dressing down the guys being like, you're going to go to Vietnam and no one's going to give a shit or whatever it was that she said.
I don't know. I'm sorry.
It's sad for all parties involved except for Pete. He gets to find out there's a vending machine.
I just think that whole scene, I'm like, I don't buy it. Like, I buy that she would try to do that. I don't buy that it works so well. I feel like they let her just keep going with it. I'm just like, I don't know. Weiner calls it withering. Yeah. But anyway.
Unfortunately, I do need to get going, but I will. You guys keep recording.
No, we're done. That's it. Can't do it without you, Roshan.
Oh, thank you. All I have to say is I thought the Witching Brew Mountain Dew ad was badass, and I think that Mountain Dew should have kept it. I think they were wrong to not accept that pitch.
Hey, they still have time. They still have time to make it happen. But
yeah,
thanks for listening to Mad Men. Thanks for listening to the show. We'll be back next time talk about The Beautiful Girls, which they're going to be talking about mine and Mike's wives. That's so nice. See you all later.
That's really kind.
That's nice. That's very wholesome.